Amidst the arms of the Lombards and under the despotism of the Greeks, we again inquire into the fate of Rome, which had reached, about the close of the 6th century, the lowest period of her depression. By the removal of the seat of empire and the successive loss of the provinces, the sources of public and private opulence were exhausted. The lofty tree under whose shade the nations of the earth had reposed was deprived of its leaves and branches, and the sapless trunk was left to wither on the ground. The ministers of command and the messengers of victory no longer met on the Appian or Flaminian Way, and the hostile approach of the Lombards was often felt and continually feared. The inhabitants of a potent and peaceful capital, who visit, without an anxious thought, the garden of the adjacent country, will faintly picture in their fancy the distress of the Romans. They shut or opened their gates with a trembling hand, beheld from the walls the flames of their houses, and heard the lamentations of their brethren, who were coupled together like dogs, and dragged away into distant slavery beyond the sea and the mountains. Such incessant alarms must annihilate the pleasures and interrupt the labours of a rural life, and the Campagna of Rome was speedily reduced to the state of a dreary wilderness, in which the land is barren, the waters are impure, and the air is infectious. Curiosity and ambition no longer attracted the nations to the capital of the world. But if chance or necessity directed the steps of a wandering stranger, he contemplated with horror the vacancy and solitude of the city, and might be tempted to ask, where is the Senate? Where are the people? In a season of excessive rains, the Tiber swelled above its banks and rushed with irresistible violence into the valleys of the 7 hills. A pestilential disease arose from the stagnation of the deluge, and so rapid was the contagion that 80 persons expired in an hour in the midst of a solemn procession which implored the mercy of heaven. A society in which marriage is encouraged and industry prevails soon repairs the accidental losses of pestilence and war. But as the far greater part of the Romans was condemned to hopeless indigence and celibacy, the depopulation was constant and visible, and the gloomy enthusiasts might expect the approaching failure of the human race. Yet the number of citizens still exceeded the measure of subsistence. Their precarious food was supplied from the harvests of Sicily or Egypt, and the frequent repetition of famine betrays the inattention of the emperor to a distant province. The edifices of Rome were exposed to the same ruin and decay. The mouldering fabrics were easily overthrown by inundations, tempests, and earthquakes, and the monks, who had occupied the most advantageous stations, exulted in their base triumph over the ruins of antiquity. It is commonly believed that Pope Gregory I attacked the temples and mutilated the statues of the city, that by the command of the barbarian the Palatine Library was reduced to ashes, and that the history of Livy was the peculiar mark of his absurd and mischievous fanaticism. The writings of Gregory himself reveal his implacable aversion to the monuments of classic genius, and he points his severest censure against the profane learning of a bishop who taught the art of grammar, studied the Latin poets, and pronounced to the same voice the praises of Jupiter and those of Christ. But the evidence of his destructive rage is doubtful and recent. The Temple of Peace or the Theatre of Marcellus have been demolished by the slow operation of ages, and a formal proscription would have multiplied the copies of Virgil and Livy in the countries which were not subject to the ecclesiastical dictator. Like Thebes or Babylon or Carthage, the name of Rome might have been erased from the earth, if the city had not been animated by a vital principle which again restored her to honour and dominion. A vague tradition was embraced that 2 Jewish teachers, a tent-maker and a fisherman, had formerly been executed in the circus of Nero, and at the end of 500 years their genuine or fictitious relics were adored as the palladium of Christian Rome. The pilgrims of the East and West resorted to the holy threshold, but the shrines of the apostles were guarded by miracles and invisible terrors, and it was not without fear that the pious Catholic approached the object of his worship. It was fatal to touch, it was dangerous to behold, the bodies of the saints, and those who, from the purest motives, presumed to disturb the repose of the sanctuary, were affrighted by visions or punished with sudden death. The unreasonable request of an empress, who wished to deprive the Romans of their sacred treasure, the head of St. Paul, was rejected with the deepest abhorrence. And the Pope asserted, most probably with truth, that a linen which had been sanctified in the neighbourhood of his body, or the filings of his chain, which it was sometimes easy and sometimes impossible to obtain, possessed an equal degree of miraculous virtue. But the power as well as the virtue of the apostles resided with living energy in the breast of their successors. And the chair of St. Peter was filled under the reign of Maurice by the first and greatest of the name of Gregory. His grandfather Felix had himself been pope, and as the bishops were already bound by the law of celibacy, his consecration must have been preceded by the death of his wife. The parents of Gregory, Sylvia and Gordian, were the noblest of the Senate and the most pious of the Church of Rome. His female relations were numbered among the saints and virgins, and his own figure, with those of his father and mother, were represented near 300 years in a family portrait, which he offered to the monastery of St. Andrew. The design and colouring of this picture afford an honourable testimony that the art of painting was cultivated by the Italians of the 6th century. But the most abject ideas must be entertained of their taste and learning, since the epistles of Gregory, his sermons and his dialogues, are the work of a man who was second in erudition to none of his contemporaries. His birth and abilities had raised him to the office of prefect of the city, and he enjoyed the merit of renouncing the pomp and vanities of this world. His ample patrimony was dedicated to the foundation of 7 monasteries, 1 in Rome and 6 in Sicily. And it was the wish of Gregory that he might be unknown in this life and glorious only in the next. Yet his devotion, and it might be sincere, pursued the path which would have been chosen by a crafty and ambitious statesman. The talents of Gregory and the splendour which accompanied his retreat rendered him dear and useful to the Church, and implicit obedience has been always inculcated as the first duty of a monk. As soon as he had received the character of deacon, Gregory was sent to reside at the Byzantine court, the nuncio or minister of the Apostolic See, and he boldly assumed, in the name of St. Peter, a tone of independent dignity which would have been criminal and dangerous in the most illustrious layman of the empire. He returned to Rome with a just increase of reputation, and after a short exercise of the monastic virtues, he was dragged from the cloister to the papal throne by the unanimous voice of the clergy, the Senate, and the people. He alone resisted, or seemed to resist, his own elevation, and his humble petition that Maurice would be pleased to reject the choice of the Romans could only serve to exalt his character in the eyes of the emperor and the public. When the fatal mandate was proclaimed, Gregory solicited the aid of some friendly merchants to convey him in a basket beyond the gates of Rome, and modestly concealed himself some days among the woods and mountains, till his retreat was discovered, as it is said, by a celestial light. The pontificate of Gregory the Great, which lasted 13 years, 6 months and 10 days, is one of the most edifying periods of the history of the Church. His virtues, and even his faults, a singular mixture of simplicity and cunning, of pride and humility, of sense and superstition, were happily suited to his station and to the temper of the times. In his rival, the Patriarch of Constantinople, he condemned the anti-Christian title of universal bishop, which the successor of St. Peter was too haughty to concede and too feeble to assume, and the ecclesiastical jurisdiction of Gregory was confined to the triple character of Bishop of Rome, Primate of Italy, and Apostle of the West. He frequently ascended the pulpit and kindled by his rude though pathetic eloquence the congenial passions of his audience. The language of the Jewish prophets was interpreted and applied, and the minds of a people depressed by their present calamities were directed to the hopes and fears of the invisible world. His precepts and example defined the model of the Roman liturgy, the distribution of the parishes, the calendar of festivals, the order of processions, the service of the priests and deacons, the variety and change of sacerdotal garments. Till the last days of his life, he officiated in the canon of the Mass, which continued above 3 hours. The Gregorian chant has preserved the vocal and instrumental music of the theatre, and the rough voices of the barbarians attempted to imitate the melody of the Roman school.
Maurice was to abdicate ignominiously, and the rival Greens and Blues in Constantinople fought for several days to force their will for his successor. Maurice was brought low, according to Gibbon, by that age-old issue, trying to reform the army and bring it under civilian control. The mutinous army nominated an ordinary centurion from its own ranks as its leader against Maurice.
Phocas made his public entry in a chariot drawn by 4 white horses. The revolt of the troops was rewarded by a lavish donative, and the new sovereign, after visiting the palace, beheld from his throne the games of the hippodrome. In a dispute of precedency between the 2 factions, his partial judgment inclined in favor of the Greens. "Remember that Maurice is still alive," resounded from the opposite side, and the indiscreet clamour of the Blues admonished and stimulated the cruelty of the tyrant. The ministers of death were dispatched to Chalcedon. They dragged the emperor from his sanctuary, and 5 sons of Maurice were successively murdered before the eyes of their agonizing parent. At each stroke, which he felt in his heart, he found strength to rehearse a pious ejaculation, "Thou art just, O Lord, and thy judgments are righteous." And such in the last moments was his rigid attachment to truth and justice, that he revealed to the soldiers the pious falsehood of a nurse who presented her own child in the place of a royal infant. The tragic scene was finally closed by the execution of the emperor himself, in the 20th year of his reign and the 63rd of his age. The bodies of the father and his 5 sons were cast into the sea. Their heads were exposed to Constantinople to the insults or pity of the multitude, and it was not till some signs of putrefaction had appeared that Phocas connived at the private burial of these venerable remains. In that grave, the faults and errors of Maurice were kindly interred. His fate alone was remembered, and at the end of 20 years, in the recital of the history of Theophylact, the mournful tale was interrupted by the tears of the audience. Such tears must have flowed in secret, and such compassion would have been criminal under the reign of Phocas, who was peaceably acknowledged in the provinces of the East and West. The images of the emperor and his wife Leontia were exposed in the Lateran to the veneration of the clergy and senate of Rome, and afterwards deposited in the palace of the Caesars between those of Constantine and Theodosius. As a subject and a Christian, it was the duty of Gregory to acquiesce in the established government. But the joyful applause with which he salutes the fortune of the assassin has sullied with indelible disgrace the character of the saint. The successor of the apostles might have inculcated with decent firmness the guilt of blood and the necessity of repentance. He is content to celebrate the deliverance of the people and the fall of the oppressor, to rejoice that the piety and benignity of Phocas have been raised by Providence to the imperial throne, to pray that his hands may be strengthened against all his enemies, and to express a wish, perhaps a prophecy, that after a long and triumphant reign he may be transferred from a temporal to an everlasting kingdom. I have already traced the steps of a revolution so pleasing, in Gregory's opinion, both to heaven and earth, and Phocas does not appear less hateful in the exercise than in the acquisition of power. The pencil of an impartial historian has delineated the portrait of a monster, his diminutive and deformed person, the closeness of his shaggy eyebrows, his red hair, his beardless chin, and his cheek disfigured and discoloured by a formidable scar. Ignorant of letters, of laws, and even of arms, He indulged in the supreme rank a more ample privilege of lust and drunkenness, and his brutal pleasures were either injurious to his subjects or disgraceful to himself. Without assuming the office of a prince, he renounced the profession of a soldier, and the reign of Phocas afflicted Europe with ignominious peace, and Asia with desolating war. His savage temper was inflamed by passion, hardened by fear, exasperated by resistance or reproach. The flight of Theodosius, the eldest son of Maurice, to the Persian court had been intercepted by a rapid pursuit or a deceitful message. He was beheaded at Nice, and the last hours of the young prince were soothed by the comforts of religion and the consciousness of innocence. Yet his phantom disturbed the repose of the usurper. A whisper was circulated through the East that the son of Maurice was still alive. The people expected their avenger, and the widow and daughters of the late emperor would have adopted as their son and brother the vilest of mankind. In the massacre of the imperial family, the mercy, or rather the discretion, of Phocas had spared these unhappy females, and they were decently confined to a private house. But the spirit of the Empress Constantina, still mindful of her father, her husband, and her sons, aspired to freedom and revenge. At the dead of night she escaped to the sanctuary of St. Sophia, but her tears and the gold of her associate Germanus were insufficient to provoke an insurrection. Her life was forfeited to revenge and even to justice. But the patriarch obtained and pledged an oath for her safety. A monastery was allotted for her prison, and the widow of Maurice accepted and abused the lenity of his assassin. The discovery or the suspicion of a second conspiracy dissolved the engagements and rekindled the fury of Phocas. A matron who commanded the respect and pity of mankind, the daughter, wife, and mother of emperors, was tortured like the vilest malefactor to force a confession of her designs and associates, and the Empress Constantina, with her 3 innocent daughters, was beheaded at Chalcedon on the same ground which had been stained with the blood of her husband and 5 sons. After such an example, it would be superfluous to enumerate the names and sufferings of meaner victims. Their condemnation was seldom preceded by the forms of trial, and their punishment was embittered by the refinements of cruelty. Their eyes were pierced, their tongues were torn from the root, their hands and feet were amputated. Some expired under the lash, others in the flames, others again were transfixed with arrows, and a simple, speedy death was mercy, which they could rarely obtain. The hippodrome, the sacred asylum of the pleasures and the liberty of the Romans, was polluted with heads and limbs and mangled bodies. And the companions of Phocas were the most sensible that neither his favour nor their services could protect them from a tyrant, the worthy rival of the Caligulas and Domitians of the first age of the empire. A daughter of Phocas, his only child, was given in marriage to the patrician Crispus, and the royal images of the bride and bridegroom were indiscreetly placed in the circus by the side of the emperor. The father must desire that his posterity should inherit the fruit of his crimes, but the monarch was offended by this premature and popular association. The tribunes of the Green faction, who accused the officious error of their sculptors, were condemned to instant death. Their lives were granted to the prayers of the people, but Crispus might reasonably doubt whether a jealous usurper could forget and pardon his involuntary competition. The Green faction was alienated by the ingratitude of Phocas and the loss of their privileges. Every province of the empire was ripe for rebellion, and Heraclius, Exarch of Africa, persisted above 2 years in refusing all tribute and obedience to the centurion who disgraced the throne of Constantinople. By the secret emissaries of Crispus and the Senate, the independent exarch was solicited to save and to govern his country. But his ambition was chilled by age, and he resigned the dangerous enterprise to his son Heraclius, and to Nicetus, the son of Gregory, his friend and lieutenant. The powers of Africa were armed by the 2 adventurous youths. They agreed that the one should navigate the fleet from Carthage to Constantinople, that the other should lead an army through Egypt and Asia, and that the imperial purple should be the reward of diligence and success. A faint rumour of their undertaking was conveyed to the ears of Phocas, and the wife and mother of the younger Heraclius were secured as the hostages of his faith. But the treacherous heart of Crispus extenuated the distant peril. The means of defence were neglected or delayed, and the tyrant supinely slept till the African navy cast anchor in the Hellespont. Their standard was joined at Abydos by the fugitives and exiles who thirsted for revenge. The ships of Heraclius, whose lofty masts were adorned with the holy symbols of religion, steered their triumphant course through the Propontis, and Phocas beheld from the windows of the palace his approaching and inevitable fate. The Green faction was tempted by gifts and promises to oppose a feeble and fruitless resistance to the landing of the Africans. But the people, and even the guards, were determined by the well-timed defection of Crispus, and the tyrant was seized by a private enemy who boldly invaded the solitude of the palace. Stripped of the diadem and purple, clothed in a vile habit and loaded with chains, he was transported in a small boat to the imperial galley of Heraclius, who reproached him with the crimes of his abominable reign. "Wilt thou govern better?" were the last words of the despair of Phocas. After suffering each variety of insult and torture, his head was severed from his body, the mangled trunk was cast into the flames, and the same treatment was inflicted on the statues of the vain usurper and the seditious banner of the Green faction. The voice of the clergy, the Senate, and the people invited Heraclius to ascend the throne which he had purified from guilt and ignominy. After some graceful hesitation, he yielded to their entreaties. His coronation was accompanied by that of his wife, Eudoxia, and their posterity, till the fourth generation, continued to reign over the empire of the East. The voyage of Heraclius had been easy and prosperous. The tedious march of Nicetas was not accomplished before the decision of the contest, but he submitted without a murmur to the fortune of his friend, and his laudable intentions were rewarded with an equestrian statue and a daughter of the emperor. It was more difficult to trust the fidelity of Crispus, whose recent services were recompensed by the command of the Cappadocian army. His arrogance soon provoked and seemed to excuse the ingratitude of his new sovereign. In the presence of the Senate, the son-in-law of Phocas was condemned to embrace the monastic life, and the sentence was justified by the weighty observation of Heraclius that the man who had betrayed his father could never be faithful to his friend. Of the characters conspicuous in history, that of Heraclius is one of the most extraordinary and inconsistent. In the first of the last years of a long reign, the emperor appears to be the slave of sloth, of pleasure, or of superstition, the careless and impotent spectator of the public calamities. But the languid mists of the morning and evening are separated by the brightness of the meridian sun. The Arcadius of the palace arose the Caesar of the camp, and the honour of Rome and Heraclius was gloriously retrieved by the exploits and trophies of 6 adventurous campaigns. It was the duty of the Byzantine historians to have revealed the causes of his slumber and vigilance. At this distance, we can only conjecture that he was endowed with more personal courage than political resolution, that he was detained by the charms and perhaps the arts of his niece Martina, with whom, after the death of Eudocia, he contracted an incestuous marriage, and that he yielded to the base advice of the councillors who urged as a fundamental law that the life of the emperor should never be exposed in the field.
Heraclius fought a long and hard campaign against the king of Persia, Khosroes, venturing as far as what today is Iraq, entering the city of Isfahan, where no Roman emperor had previously set foot. There, Khosroes' forces surrounded Heraclius, who defeated the Persians, chasing them into the fortified cities of Medina and Assyria. Eventually, they met again on the battlefield at Nineveh.
In the Battle of Nineveh, which was fiercely fought from daybreak to the 11th hour, 28 standards, besides those which might be broken or torn, were taken from the Persians. The greatest part of their army was cut in pieces, and the victors, concealing their own loss, passed the night on the field. They acknowledged that on this occasion it was less difficult to kill than to discomfit the soldiers of Khosroes, Amidst the bodies of their friends, no more than 2 bowshot from the enemy, the remnant of the Persian cavalry stood firm till the 7th hour of the night. About the 8th hour they retired to their unrifled camp, collected their baggage, and dispersed on all sides from the want of orders rather than of resolution. The diligence of Heraclius was not less admirable in the use of victory. By a march of 48 miles in 24 hours, his vanguard occupied the bridges of the Great and the Lesser Zab, and the cities and palaces of Assyria were opened for the first time to the Romans. It was still in the power of Chosroes to obtain a reasonable peace, and he was repeatedly pressed by the messengers of Heraclius to spare the blood of his subjects, and to relieve a humane conqueror from the painful duty of carrying fire and sword through the fairest countries of Asia. But the pride of the Persian had not yet sunk to the level of his fortune. He derived a momentary confidence from the retreat of the emperor. He wept with impotent rage over the ruins of his Assyrian palaces, and disregarded too long the rising murmurs of the nation who complained that their lives and fortunes were sacrificed to the obstinacy of an old man. That unhappy old man was himself tortured with the sharpest pains both of mind and body, and in the consciousness of his approaching end he resolved to fix the tiara on the head of Merdaza, the most favoured of his sons. But the will of Chosroes was no longer revered, and Siroes, who gloried in the rank and merit of his mother Sira, had conspired with the malcontents to assert and anticipate the rights of primogeniture. 22 satraps, they styled themselves patriots, were tempted by the wealth and honours of a new reign. To the soldiers, the heir of Chosroes promised an increase of pay; to the Christians, the free exercise of their religion; to the captives, liberty and rewards; and to the nation, instant peace and the reduction of taxes. It was determined by the conspirators that Siroes, with the ensigns of royalty, should appear in the camp, and if the enterprise should fail, his escape was contrived to the imperial court. But the new monarch was saluted with unanimous acclamations. The flight of Chosroes, yet where could he have fled, was rudely arrested. 18 sons were massacred before his face, and he was thrown into a dungeon where he expired on the 5th day. The Greeks and modern Persians minutely describe how Chosroes was insulted and famished and tortured by the command of an inhuman son who so far surpassed the example of his father. But at the time of his death, what tongue would relate the story of the parricide? What eye could penetrate into the tower of darkness? According to the faith and mercy of his Christian enemies, he sunk without hope into a still deeper abyss, and it will not be denied that tyrants of every age and sect are the best entitled to such infernal abodes. The glory of the house of Sassan ended with the life of Chosroes. His unnatural son enjoyed only 8 months the fruit of his crimes, and in the space of 4 years the regal title was assumed by 9 candidates who disputed with the sword or dagger the fragments of an exhausted monarchy. Every province and each city of Persia was the scene of independence, of discord, and of blood, and the state of anarchy prevailed about 8 years longer, till the factions were silenced and united under the common yoke of the Arabian caliphs. As soon as the mountains became passable, the emperor received the welcome news of the success of the conspiracy, the death of Chosroes, and the elevation of his eldest son to the throne of Persia. The authors of the revolution, eager to display their merits in the court or camp of Tauris, preceded the ambassadors of Siroes, who delivered the letters of their master to his brother, the emperor of the Romans. In the language of the usurpers of every age, he imputes his own crimes to the deity, and without degrading his equal majesty, he offers to reconcile the long discord of the two nations by a treaty of peace and alliance more durable than brass or iron. The conditions of the treaty were easily defined and faithfully executed. In the recovery of the standards and prisoners which had fallen into the hands of the Persians, the emperor imitated the example of Augustus. Their care of the national dignity was celebrated by the poets of the times, but the decay of genius may be measured by the distance between Horace and George of Pisidia. The subjects and brethren of Heraclius were redeemed from persecution, slavery, and exile. But instead of the Roman eagles, the true wood of the Holy Cross was restored to the importunate demands of the successor of Constantine. The victor was not ambitious of enlarging the weakness of the empire. The son of Chosroes abandoned without regret the conquests of his father. The Persians who evacuated the cities of Syria and Egypt were honorably conducted to the frontier, and a war which had wounded the vitals of the two monarchies produced no change in their external and relative situation. The return of Heraclius from Taurus to Constantinople was a perpetual triumph, and after the exploits of 6 glorious campaigns, he peaceably enjoyed the Sabbath of his toils. After a long impatience, the Senate, the clergy, and the people went forth to meet their hero with tears and acclamations, with olive branches and innumerable lamps. He entered the capital in a chariot drawn by 4 elephants, and as soon as the emperor could disengage himself from the tumult of public joy, he tasted more genuine satisfaction in the embraces of his mother and his son. The succeeding year was illustrated by a triumph of a very different kind, the restitution of the true cross to the Holy Sepulchre. Heraclius performed in person the pilgrimage of Jerusalem. The identity of the relic was verified by the discreet patriarch, and this august ceremony has been commemorated by the annual festival of the exaltation of the cross. Before the emperor presumed to tread the consecrated ground, he was instructed to strip himself of the diadem and purple, the pomp and vanity of the world. But in the judgment of his clergy, the persecution of the Jews was more easily reconciled with the precepts of the gospel. He again ascended his throne to receive the congratulations of the ambassadors of France and India, and the fame of Moses, Alexander, and Hercules was eclipsed in the popular estimation by the superior merit and glory of the great Heraclius. Yet the deliverer of the East was indigent and feeble. Of the Persian spoils, the most valuable portion had been expended in the war, distributed to the soldiers, or buried by an unlucky tempest in the waves of the Euxine. The conscience of the emperor was oppressed by the obligation of restoring the wealth of the clergy, which he had borrowed for their own defence. A perpetual fund was required to satisfy these inexorable creditors. The provinces, already wasted by the arms and avarice of the Persians, were compelled to a second payment of the same taxes, and the arrears of a simple citizen, the treasurer of Damascus, were commuted to a fine of 100,000 pieces of gold. The loss of 200,000 soldiers who had fallen by the sword was of less fatal importance than the decay of arts, agriculture, and population in this long and destructive war. And although a victorious army had been formed under the standard of Heraclius, the unnatural effort appears to have exhausted rather than exercised their strength. While the emperor triumphed at Constantinople or Jerusalem, an obscure town on the confines of Syria was pillaged by the Saracens, and they cut in pieces some troops who advanced to its relief. An ordinary and trifling occurrence, had it not been the prelude of a mighty revolution. These robbers were the apostles of Mohammed. Their fanatic valor had emerged from the desert, and in the last 8 years of his reign, Heraclius lost to the Arabs the same provinces which he had rescued from the Persians. I have now deduced from Trajan to Constantine, from Constantine to Heraclius, the regular series of the Roman emperors, and faithfully exposed the prosperous and adverse fortunes of their reigns. 5 centuries of the decline and fall of the empire have already elapsed, but a period of more than 800 years still separates me from the term of my labours, the taking of Constantinople by the Turks. Should I persevere in the same course? Should I observe the same measure? a prolix and slender thread would be spun through many a volume, nor would the patient reader find an adequate reward of instruction or amusement. At every step, as we sink deeper in the decline and fall of the Eastern Empire, the annals of each succeeding reign would impose a more ungrateful and melancholy task. These annals must continue to repeat a tedious and uniform tale of weakness and misery. The natural connection of causes and events would be broken by frequent and hasty transitions, and a minute accumulation of circumstances must destroy the light and effect of those general pictures which compose the use and ornament of a remote history. From the time of Heraclius, the Byzantine theatre is contracted and darkened. The line of empire, which had been defined by the laws of Justinian and the arms of Belisarius, recedes on all sides from our view. The Roman name, the proper subject of our inquiries, is reduced to a narrow corner of Europe, to the lonely suburbs of Constantinople. And the fate of the Greek Empire has been compared to that of the Rhine, which loses itself in the sands before its waters can mingle with the ocean. The scale of dominion is diminished to our view by the distance of time and place, nor is the loss of external splendor compensated by the nobler gifts of virtue and genius. In the last moments of her decay, Constantinople was doubtless more opulent and populous than Athens at her most flourishing era, when a scanty sum of 6,000 talents, or 1,200,000 pounds sterling, was possessed by 21,000 male citizens of an adult age. But each of these citizens was a free man, who dared to assert the liberty of his thoughts, words, and actions, whose person and property were guarded by equal law, and who exercised his independent vote in the government of the Republic. Their numbers seem to be multiplied by the strong and various discriminations of character. Under the shield of freedom, on the wings of emulation and vanity, each Athenian aspired to the level of the national dignity. From this commanding eminence, some chosen spirits soared beyond the reach of a vulgar eye, and the chances of superior merit in a great and populous kingdom, as they are proved by experience, would excuse the computation of imaginary millions. The territories of Athens, Sparta, and their allies do not exceed a moderate province of France or England. But after the trophies of Salamis and Plataea, they expand in our fancy to the gigantic size of Asia, which had been trampled under the feet of the victorious Greeks. But the subjects of the Byzantine Empire, who assume and dishonor the names both of Greeks and Romans, present a dead uniformity of abject vices, which are neither softened by the weakness of humanity, nor animated by the vigor of memorable crimes. The freemen of antiquity might repeat with generous enthusiasm the sentence of Homer, that on the first day of his servitude the captive is deprived of one half of his manly virtue. But the poet had only seen the effects of civil or domestic slavery, nor could he foretell that the second moiety of manhood must be annihilated by the spiritual despotism which shackles not only the actions but even the thoughts of the prostrate votary. By this double yoke the Greeks were oppressed under the successors of Heraclius. The tyrant, a law of eternal justice, was degraded by the vices of his subjects. And on the throne, in the camp, in the schools, we search, perhaps with fruitless diligence, the names and characters that may deserve to be rescued from oblivion. From these considerations, I should have abandoned without regret the Greek slaves and their servile historians, had I not reflected that the fate of the Byzantine monarchy is passively connected with the most splendid and important revolutions which have changed the state of the world. The space of the lost provinces was immediately replenished, with new colonies and rising kingdoms. The active virtues of peace and war deserted from the vanquished to the victorious nations. And it is in their origin and conquests, in their religion and government, that we must explore the causes and effects of the decline and fall of the Eastern Empire. Nor will this scope of narrative, the riches and variety of these materials, be incompatible with the unity of design and composition. As in his daily prayers, the Mussulman of Fez or Delhi still turns his face towards the temple of Mecca, the historian's eye shall be always fixed on the city of Constantinople. The excursive line may embrace the wilds of Arabia and Tartary, but the circle will be ultimately reduced to the decreasing limit of the Roman monarchy. The Emperor Heraclius had punished a tyrant and ascended his throne, and the memory of his reign is perpetuated by the transient conquest and irreparable loss of the eastern provinces. After the death of Eudocia, his first wife, he disobeyed the patriarch and violated the laws by his second marriage with his niece Martina. And the superstition of the Greeks beheld the judgment of heaven in the diseases of the father and the deformity of his offspring. But the opinion of an illegitimate birth is sufficient to distract the choice and loosen the obedience of the people. The ambition of Martina was quickened by maternal love, and perhaps by the envy of a stepmother, and the aged husband was too feeble to withstand the arts of conjugal allurements. Constantine, his eldest son, enjoyed in a mature age the title of Augustus. But the weakness of his constitution required a colleague and a guardian, and he yielded with secret reluctance to the partition of the empire. The Senate was summoned to the palace to ratify or attest the association of Heracleonas, the son of Martina. The imposition of the diadem was consecrated by the prayer and blessing of the patriarch. The senators and patricians adored the majesty of the great emperor and the partners of his reign, and as soon as the doors were thrown open, they were hailed by the tumultuary but important voice of the soldiers. After an interval of 5 months, the pompous ceremonies which formed the essence of the Byzantine state were celebrated in the cathedral and the hippodrome. The concord of the royal brothers was affectedly displayed by the younger leaning on the arm of the elder, and the name of Martina was mingled in the reluctant or venal acclamations of the people. Heraclius survived this association about 2 years. His last testimony declared his 2 sons the equal heirs of the Eastern Empire, and commanded them to honor this widow, Martina, as their mother and their sovereign.
But Martina was not to survive long as empress. The populace forced her to step down in favor of Constantine III, whose reign lasted but 103 days. Thereupon, Martina again assumed the purple robes of the emperor, but as Gibbon writes, the incestuous widow of Heraclius was universally abhorred, and Constantine's 2 orphan children became the focus of popular support. Martina and her son Heracleonas were found guilty of the murder of Constantine. She had her tongue cut out, he his nose sliced off, and both went into exile. Constans II, the elder of the 2 sons of Constantine, then took the throne, only to perish soon after.
A servant who waited in the bath, after pouring warm water on his head, struck him violently with a vase. He fell, stunned by the blow and suffocated by the water, and his attendants, who wondered at the tedious delay, beheld with indifference the corpse of their lifeless emperor. The troops of Sicily invested with the purple an obscure youth whose inimitable beauty eluded, and it might easily elude, the declining art of the painters and sculptors of the age. Constans had left in the Byzantine palace 3 sons, the eldest of whom had been clothed in his infancy with the purple. When the father summoned them to attend his person in Sicily, these precious hostages were detained by the Greeks, and a firm refusal informed him that they were the children of the state. The news of his murder was conveyed with almost supernatural speed from Syracuse to Constantinople, and Constantine, the eldest of his sons, inherited his throne without being the heir of the public hatred. His subjects contributed with zeal and alacrity to chastise the guilt and presumption of a province which had usurped the rights of the Senate and people. The young emperor sailed from the Hellespont with a powerful fleet, and the legions of Rome and Carthage were assembled under his standard in the harbour of Syracuse. The defeat of the Sicilian tyrant was easy, his punishment just, and his beauteous head was exposed in the hippodrome. But I cannot applaud the clemency of a prince who, among a crowd of victims, condemned the son of a patrician for deploring with some bitterness the execution of a virtuous father. The youth was castrated. He survived the operation, and the memory of this indecent cruelty is preserved by the elevation of Germanus to the rank of a patriarch and saint. After pouring this bloody libation on his father's tomb, Constantine returned to his capital, and the growth of his young beard during the Sicilian voyage was announced by the familiar surname of Pogonatus to the Grecian world. But his reign, like that of his predecessor, was stained with fraternal discord. On his two brothers, Heraclius and Tiberius, he had bestowed the title of Augustus, an empty title, for they continued to languish without trust or power in the solitude of the palace. At their secret instigation, the troops of the Anatolian theme or province approached the city on the Asiatic side, demanded for the royal brothers the partition or exercise of sovereignty, and supported their seditious claim by a theological argument. They were Christians, they cried, and Orthodox Catholics, the sincere votaries of the holy and undivided Trinity. Since there are three equal persons in heaven, it is reasonable there should be three equal persons upon earth. The emperor invited these learned divines to a friendly conference, in which they might propose their arguments to the Senate. They obeyed the summons, but the prospect of their bodies hanging on the gibbet in the suburb of Galata reconciled their companions to the unity of the reign of Constantine. He pardoned his brothers, and their names were still pronounced in the public acclamations. But on the repetition or suspicion of a similar offence, the obnoxious princes were deprived of their titles and noses, in the presence of the Catholic bishops who were assembled at Constantinople in the Sixth General Synod. After the decease of his father, the inheritance of the Roman world devolved to Justinian II, and the name of a triumphant lawgiver was dishonoured by the vices of a boy who imitated his namesake only in the expensive luxury of building. His passions were strong, his understanding was feeble, and he was intoxicated with a foolish pride that his birth had given him the command of millions, of whom the smallest community would not have chosen him for their local magistrate. His favourite ministers were two beings the least susceptible of human sympathy, a eunuch and a monk. To the one he abandoned the palace, to the other the finances. The former corrected the emperor's mother with a scourge, the latter suspended the insolvent tributaries with their heads downwards over a slow and smoky fire. Since the days of Commodus and Caracalla, the cruelty of the Roman princes had most commonly been the effect of their fear. But Justinian, who possessed some vigour of character, enjoyed the sufferings and braved the revenge of his subjects about 10 years, till the measure was full of his crimes and of their patience. In a dark dungeon, Leontius, a general of reputation, had groaned above 3 years with some of the noblest and most deserving of the patricians. He was suddenly drawn forth to assume the government of Greece, and this promotion of an injured man was a mark of the contempt rather than of the confidence of his prince. As he was followed to the port by the kind offices of his friends, Leontius observed with a sigh that he was a victim adorned for sacrifice, and that inevitable death would pursue his footsteps. They ventured to reply that glory and empire might be the recompense of a generous resolution, that every order of men abhorred the reign of a monster, and that the hands of 200,000 patriots expected only the voice of a leader. The night was chosen for their deliverance, and in the first effort of the conspirators, the prefect was slain and the prisons were forced open. The emissaries of Leontius proclaimed in every street, "Christians, two saints of fear," and the seasonable text of the patriarch, "This is the day of the Lord," was the prelude of an inflammatory sermon. From the church the people adjourned to the hippodrome. Justinian, in whose cause not a sword had been drawn, was dragged before these tumultuary judges, and their clamours demanded the instant death of the tyrant. But Leontius, who was already clothed with the purple, cast an eye of pity on the prostrate son of his own benefactor and of so many emperors. The life of Justinian was spared. The amputation of his nose, perhaps of his tongue, was imperfectly performed. The happy flexibility of the Greek language could impose the name of Rhinotmetus, and the mutilated tyrant was banished to Chersonai in Cream Tartary, a lonely settlement where corn, wine, and oil were imported as foreign luxuries.
Justinian's banishment lasted but 10 years. Leontius himself was dethroned and mutilated by the rebel Apsimar, who assumed the name Tiberius. Hearing this, Justinian returned at the head of an army and entered Constantinople, emperor once more. He took swift and bloody vengeance against the usurpers.
Before their execution, Leontius and Apsimar were cast prostrate in chains beneath the throne of the emperor, and Justinian, planting a foot on each of their necks, contemplated above an hour the chariot race, while the inconstant people shouted in the words of the psalmist, "Thou shalt trample on the asp and basilisk, and on the lion and dragon shalt thou set thy foot." The universal defection which he had once experienced might provoke him to repeat the wish of Caligula that the Roman people had but one head. Yet I shall presume to observe that such a wish is unworthy of an ingenious tyrant, since his revenge and cruelty would have been extinguished by a single blow, instead of the slow variety of tortures which Justinian inflicted on the victims of his anger. His pleasures were inexhaustible. Neither private virtue nor public service could expiate the guilt of active or even passive obedience to an established government. And during the 6 years of his new reign, he considered the axe, the cord, and the rack as the only instruments of royalty. All are guilty and all must perish, was the mandate of Justinian, and the bloody execution was entrusted to his favourite, Stephen, who was recommended by the epithet of the savage. Yet even the savage Stephen imperfectly accomplished the intentions of his sovereign. The slowness of his attack allowed the greater part of the inhabitants to withdraw into the country, and the minister of vengeance contented himself with reducing the youth of both sexes to a state of servitude, with roasting alive 7 of the principal citizens, with drowning 20 in the sea, and with reserving 42 in chains to receive their doom from the mouth of the emperor. Destitute of friends, Justinian was deserted by his barbarian guards, and the stroke of the assassin was praised as an act of patriotism and Roman virtue. His son Tiberius had taken refuge in a church. His aged grandmother guarded the door, and the innocent youth, suspending round his neck the most formidable relics, embraced with one hand the altar, with the other the wood of the true cross. But the popular fury that dares to trample on superstition is deaf to the cries of humanity, and the race of Heraclius was extinguished after a reign of 100 years.
Between 711 and 717 AD, between the fall of the Heraclian and the rise of the Isaurian dynasty, were 3 short reigns. Philippicus was murdered in his sleep, Anastasius resigned, and Theodosius died peacefully, giving way to the founder of the Isaurian dynasty, Leo III, who ruled peaceably for 24 years, passing the purple on to his son, Constantine V, surnamed Copronymus.
In a long reign of 34 years, the son and successor of Leo, Constantine V, surnamed Copronymus, attacked with less temperate zeal the images or idols of the Church. Their votaries have exhausted the bitterness of religious gall in their portrait of this spotted panther, this Antichrist, this flying dragon of the serpent seed, who surpassed the vices of Elagabalus and Nero. His reign was a long butchery of whatever was most noble or holy or innocent in his empire. In person, the emperor assisted at the execution of his victims, surveyed their agonies, listened to their groans, and indulged, without satiating, his appetite for blood. A plate of noses was accepted as a grateful offering, and his domestics were often scourged or mutilated by the royal hand. His surname was derived from his pollution of his baptismal font. The infant might be excused. but the manly pleasures of Copronymus degraded him below the level of a brute. His lust confounded the eternal distinctions of sex and species, and he seemed to extract some unnatural delight from the objects most offensive to human sense. In his religion, the iconoclast was a heretic, a Jew, a Mohammedan, a pagan, and an atheist. And his belief of an invisible power could be discovered only in his magic rites, human victims, and nocturnal sacrifices to Venus and the demons of antiquity. His life was stained with the most opposite vices, and the ulcers which covered his body anticipated before his death the sentiment of hell tortures. Of these accusations, which I have so patiently copied, a part is refuted by its own absurdity, and in the private anecdotes of the life of princes, the lie is more easy, as the detection is more difficult. Without adopting the pernicious maxim that where much is alleged, something must be true, I can however discern that Constantine V was dissolute and cruel. Calumny is more prone to exaggerate than to invent, and her licentious tongue is checked in some measure by the experience of the age and country to which she appeals. Of the bishops and monks, the generals and magistrates who were said to have suffered under his reign, the numbers are recorded, the names were conspicuous, the execution was public, the mutilation visible and permanent. The Catholics hated the person and government of Copronymus, but even their hatred is a proof of their oppression. They dissembled the provocations which might excuse or justify his rigour, but even these provocations must gradually inflame his resentment and harden his temper in the use or the abuse of despotism. Yet the character of the fifth Constantine was not devoid of merit, nor did his government always deserve the curses or the contempt of the Greeks. From the confession of his enemies, I am informed of the restoration of an ancient aqueduct, of the redemption of 2,500 captives, of the uncommon plenty of the times, and of the new colonies with which he repeopled Constantinople and the Thracian cities. They reluctantly praise his activity and courage. He was on horseback in the field at the head of his legions, and although the fortune of his arms was various, he triumphed by sea and land on the Euphrates and the Danube in civil and barbarian war. Heretical praise must be cast into the scale to counterbalance the weight of orthodox invective. The iconoclasts revered the virtues of the prince. 40 years after his death, they still prayed before the tomb of the saint. A miraculous vision was propagated by fanaticism or fraud, and the Christian hero appeared on a milk-white steed, brandishing his lance against the pagans of Bulgaria. An absurd fable, says the Catholic historian, since Copronymus is chained with the demons in the abyss of hell. Leo IV, the son of the fifth and the father of the sixth Constantine, was of a feeble constitution both of mind and body, and the principal care of his reign was the settlement of the succession. The association of the young Constantine was urged by the officious zeal of his subjects, and the emperor, conscious of his decay, complied, after a prudent hesitation, with their unanimous wishes. The royal infant, at the age of 5 years, was crowned with his mother Irene, and the national consent was ratified by every circumstance of pomp and solemnity that could dazzle the eyes or bind the conscience of the Greeks. An oath of fidelity was administered in the palace, the church, and the hippodrome to the several orders of the state, who adjured the holy names of the Son and Mother of God. Be witness, O Christ, that we will watch over the safety of Constantine, the son of Leo, expose our lives in his service, and bear true allegiance to his person and posterity. They pledged their faith on the wood of the true cross, and the act of their engagement was deposited on the altar of Saint Sophia. The first to swear, and the first to violate their oath, were the 5 sons of Copronymus by a second marriage, and the story of these princes is singular and tragic. The right of primogeniture excluded them from the throne. The injustice of their elder brother defrauded them of a legacy of about 2 millions sterling. Some vain titles were not deemed sufficient compensation for wealth and power, and they repeatedly conspired against their nephew before and after the death of his father. Their first attempt was pardoned. For the second offence, they were condemned to the ecclesiastical state. And for the third treason, Nicephorus, the eldest and most guilty, was deprived of his eyes, and his 4 brothers, Christopher, Nicetus, Anthimus, Eudoxus, were punished as a milder sentence by the amputation of their tongues. After 5 years' confinement, they escaped to the church of St. Sophia and displayed a pathetic spectacle to the people. "Countrymen and Christians," cried Nicephorus for himself and his mute brethren, "behold the sons of your emperor, if you can still recognize our features in this miserable state. A life, an imperfect life, is all that the malice of our enemies has spared. It is now threatened, and we now throw ourselves on your compassion." The rising murmur might have produced a revolution had it not been checked by the presence of a minister who soothed the unhappy princes with flattery and hope, and gently drew them from the sanctuary to the palace. They were speedily embarked for Greece, and Athens was allotted for the place of their exile. In this calm retreat, and in their helpless condition, Nicephorus and his brothers were tormented by the thirst of power, and tempted by a Sclavonian chief who offered to break their prison and to lead them in arms and in the purple to the gates of Constantinople. But the Athenian people, ever zealous in the cause of Irene, prevented her justice or cruelty, and the 5 sons of Copronymus were plunged in eternal darkness and oblivion.
Leo's wife Irene conspired against him and managed to gain the throne despite her sex. As Gibbon puts it, the Roman world bowed to the government of a female. But she was not popular. The patricians conspired against her and overthrew her, selecting the treasurer Nicephorus as her successor, of whom Gibbon writes, "Many tyrants have reigned undoubtedly more criminal than Nicephorus, but none perhaps have more deeply incurred the universal abhorrence of their people. His character was stained with the 3 odious vices of hypocrisy, ingratitude, and avarice." Nicephorus was slain in battle against the Bulgarians, and another palace administrator, Michael, became emperor. But Michael I was also quickly toppled by a palace coup, giving way to Leo V in 813 AD, whose close companion was another Michael, Michael the Phrygian.
Educated in a camp and ignorant both of laws and letters, Leo V introduced into his civil government the rigor and even cruelty of military discipline. But if his severity was sometimes dangerous to the innocent, it was always formidable to the guilty. His religious inconstancy was taxed by the epithet of chameleon, but the Catholics have acknowledged by the voice of a saint and confessors that the life of the iconoclast was useful to the Republic. The zeal of his companion Michael was repaid with riches, honours, and military command, and his subordinate talents were beneficially employed in the public service. Yet the Phrygian was dissatisfied at receiving as a favour a scanty portion of the imperial prize which he had bestowed on his equal, and his discontent, which sometimes evaporated in hasty discourse, at length assumed a more threatening and hostile aspect against a prince whom he represented as a cruel tyrant. That tyrant, however, repeatedly detected, warned, and dismissed the old companion of his arms, till fear and resentment prevailed over gratitude, and Michael, after a scrutiny into his actions and designs, was convicted of treason and sentenced to be burnt alive in the furnace of the private baths. The devout humanity of the Empress Theophano was fatal to her husband and family. A solemn day, the 25th of December, had been fixed for the execution. She urged that the anniversary of the Saviour's birth would be profaned by this inhuman spectacle, and Leo consented with reluctance to a decent respite. But on the vigil of the feast, his sleepless anxiety prompted him to visit at the dead of night the chamber in which his enemy was confined. He beheld him released from his chain and stretched on his jailer's bed in a profound slumber. Leo was alarmed at these signs of security and intelligence. But though he retired with silent steps, his entrance and departure were noticed by a slave who lay concealed in a corner of the prison. Under the pretence of requesting the spiritual aid of a confessor, Michael informed the conspirators that their lives depended on his discretion, and that a few hours were left to assure their own safety by the deliverance of their friend and country. On the great festivals, a chosen band of priests and chanters was admitted into the palace by a private gate to sing matins in the chapel, and Leo, who regulated with the same strictness the discipline of the choir and of the camp, was seldom absent from these early devotions. In the ecclesiastical habit, but with swords under their robes, the conspirators mingled with the procession, lurked in the angles of the chapel, and expected, as a signal of murder, the intonation of the first psalm by the emperor himself. The imperfect light and the uniformity of dress might have favoured his escape, while their assault was pointed against a harmless priest. But they soon discovered their mistake, and encompassed on all sides the royal victim. Without a weapon and without a friend, he grasped a weighty cross, and stood at bay against the hunters of his life. But as he asked for mercy, "This is the hour not of mercy, but of vengeance," was the inexorable reply. The stroke of a well-aimed sword separated from his body the right arm and the cross, and Leo the Armenian was slain at the foot of the altar. A memorable reverse of fortune was displayed in Michael II, who from a defect in his speech was surnamed the Stammerer. He was snatched from the fiery furnace to the sovereignty of an empire, and as in the tumult a smith could not readily be found, the fetters remained on his legs several hours after he was seated on the throne of the Caesars. The royal blood, which had been the price of his elevation, was unprofitably spent. In the purple he retained the ignoble vices of his origin, and Michael lost his provinces with a supine indifference as if they had been the inheritance of his fathers. His title was disputed by Thomas, the last of the military triumvirate, who transported into Europe 80,000 barbarians from the banks of the Tigris and the shores of the Caspian. He formed the siege of Constantinople, but the capital was defended with spiritual and carnal weapons. A Bulgarian king assaulted the camp of the Orientals, and Thomas had the misfortune or the weakness to fall alive into the power of the conqueror. The hands and feet of the rebel were amputated. He was placed on an ass, and amidst the insults of the people was led through the streets, which he sprinkled with his blood. The deprivation of manners, as savage as they were corrupt, is marked by the presence of the emperor himself. Deaf to the lamentations of a fellow soldier, he incessantly pressed the discovery of more accomplices, till his curiosity was checked by the question of an honest or guilty minister. "Would you give credit to an enemy against the most faithful of your friends?" After the death of his first wife, the emperor, at the request of the Senate, drew from her monastery Euphrosyne, the daughter of Constantine VI. Her august birth might justify a stipulation in the marriage contract that her children should equally share the empire with their elder brother. But the nuptials of Michael and Euphrosyne were barren, and she was content with the title of Mother of Theophilus, his son and successor. The Russians, who have borrowed from the Greeks the greatest part of their civil and ecclesiastical policy, preserved till the last century a singular institution in the marriage of the Tsar. They collected not the virgins of every rank and of every province, a vain and romantic idea, but the daughters of the principal nobles who awaited in the palace the choice of their sovereign. It is affirmed that a similar method was adopted in the nuptials of Theophilus. With a golden apple in his hand, he slowly walked between two lines of contending beauties. His eye was detained by the charms of Icacia, and in the awkwardness of a first declaration, the prince could only observe that, in this world, women had been the cause of much evil. "And surely, sir," she pertly replied, "they have likewise been the occasion of much good." This affectation of unseasonable wit displeased the imperial lover. He turned aside in disgust. Icacia concealed her mortification in a convent, and the modest silence of Theodora was rewarded with a golden apple. She deserved the love, but did not escape the severity of her lord. From the palace garden he beheld a vessel deeply laden and steering into the port. On the discovery that the precious cargo of Syrian luxury was the property of his wife, He condemned the ship to the flames with a sharp reproach that her avarice had degraded the character of an empress into that of a merchant. Yet his last choice entrusted her with the guardianship of the empire and her son Michael, who was left an orphan in the 5th year of his age. The restoration of images and the final extirpation of the iconoclasts has endeared her name to the devotion of the Greeks. But in the fervour of religious zeal, Theodora entertained a grateful regard for the memory and salvation of her husband. After 13 years of a prudent and frugal administration, she perceived the decline of her influence. But the second Irene imitated only the virtues of her predecessor. Instead of conspiring against the life or government of her son, she retired without a struggle, though not without a murmur, to the solitude of private life, deploring the ingratitude, the vices, and the inevitable ruin of the worthless youth. Among the successors of Nero and Elagabalus, we have not hitherto found the imitation of their vices, the character of a Roman prince who considered pleasure as the object of life and virtue as the enemy of pleasure. Whatever might have been the maternal care of Theodora in the education of Michael III, her unfortunate son was a king before he was a man. If the ambitious mother laboured to check the progress of reason, she could not cool the ebullition of passion, and her selfish policy was justly repaid by the contempt and ingratitude of the headstrong youth. At the age of 18, he rejected her authority, without feeling his own incapacity to govern the empire and himself. With Theodora, all gravity and wisdom retired from the court. Their place was supplied by the alternate dominion of vice and folly, and it was impossible, without forfeiting the public esteem, to acquire or preserve the favour of the emperor. The millions of gold and silver which had been accumulated for the service of the state were lavished on the vilest of men, who flattered his passions and shared his pleasures, and in a reign of 13 years the richest of sovereigns was compelled to strip the palace and the churches of their precious furniture. Like Nero, he delighted in the amusements of the theatre, and sighed to be surpassed in the accomplishments in which he should have blushed to excel. Yet the studies of Nero in music and poetry betrayed some symptoms of a liberal taste. The more ignoble arts of the son of Theophilus were confined to the chariot race of the hippodrome. The 4 factions which had agitated the peace still amused the idleness of the capital. For himself, the emperor assumed the blue livery. The 3 rival colours were distributed to his favourites, and in the vile though eager contention he forgot the dignity of his person and the safety of his dominions. He silenced the messenger of an invasion who presumed to divert his attention in the most critical moment of the race, and by his command the importunate beacons were extinguished that too frequently spread the alarm from Tarsus to Constantinople. The most skilful charioteers obtained the first place in his confidence and esteem. Their merit was profusely rewarded. The emperor feasted in their houses and presented their children at the baptismal font. And while he applauded his own popularity, he affected to blame the cold and stately reserve of his predecessors. The unnatural lusts which had degraded even the manhood of Nero were banished from the world. Yet the strength of Michael was consumed by the indulgence of love and intemperance. In his midnight revels, when his passions were inflamed by wine, he was provoked to issue the most sanguinary commands. And if any feelings of humanity were left, he was reduced, with the return of sense, to approve the salutary disobedience of his servants. But the most extraordinary feature in the character of Michael is the profane mockery of the religion of his country. The superstition of the Greeks might indeed excite the smile of a philosopher, but his smile would have been rational and temperate, and he must have condemned the ignorant folly of a youth who insulted the objects of public veneration. A buffoon of the court was invested in the robes of the patriarch. His 12 metropolitans, among whom the emperor was ranked, assumed their ecclesiastical garments. They used or abused the sacred vessels of the altar, and in their bacchanalian feasts the Holy Communion was administered in a nauseous compound of vinegar and mustard. Nor were these impious spectacles concealed from the eyes of the city. On the day of a solemn festival, the emperor, with his bishops or buffoons, rode on asses through the streets, encountered the true patriarch at the head of his clergy, and by their licentious shouts and obscene gestures disordered the gravity of the Christian procession. The devotion of Michael appeared only in some offence to reason or piety. He received his theatrical crowns from the statue of the Virgin, and an imperial tomb was violated for the sake of burning the bones of Constantine, the iconoclast. By this extravagant conduct, the son of Theophilus became as contemptible as he was odious. Every citizen was impatient for the deliverance of his country, and even the favourites of the moment were apprehensive that a caprice might snatch away what a caprice had bestowed. In the 30th year of his age, and in the hour of intoxication and sleep, Michael III was murdered in his chamber by the founder of a new dynasty, whom the emperor had raised to an equality of rank and power.